While, therefore, abstractly and theoretically we can admit no limitation as to the classes to whom the knowledge of the gospel ought to be communicated, no limitation as to the legitimacy of one and all of the modes of dissemination already specified, it is clear that practically or temporarily there may be an untoward state of things which renders certain restrictions absolutely unavoidable. Thus, among wandering hordes of savages, not one of whom can read, it would be absurd to circulate copies of the Bible, even if it had been translated into their language. Among them, too, it might be equally impracticable, at the outset, to establish schools for the young. Again, in such a country as China, where multitudes are taught to read, but from which all foreigners who might educate the young or preach to adults are systematically excluded, the circulation of the Bible seems only expedient to which Christians can, in the first instance, resort. And even in a country like India, where numbers have learned to read and where young and old are more or less accessible to instruction, there may be differences of opinion as to the relative prominence that is due to the respective measures so long as society is only in a transition state, the proportion of interest and resources and labor that should be lavished on each, and the distinctive form which each must assume from peculiarities of climate, locality, and government, as well as the social, religious, and hereditary opinions, habits, and prejudices of the people. At certain stages also of the further progress of society towards a more elevated state of refined enjoyment, the practicability of different plans which tend to accelerate the progression must vary with the parts which have already sent forth the most vigorous shoots, and the ability to meet efficiently the peculiar exigencies of each. Hence may arise fresh differences of opinion as to the necessity and expediency of modifying former measures, and as to the best ways of adapting these to the flux and reflux of circumstances. From these generalities, we now proceed to offer some remarks on leading certain points involved in the three great measures for conducting the work of evangelization, beginning with the Christian education scheme. Connected with this scheme, the single topic of incalculable importance in practice on which we wish, if possible, to fasten attention, may be announced in the following terms. Since the young, composing as they do the majority of every people, are destined to become the heads of families and the leaders of opinion in the next generation, and since a thorough Christian education must be allowed all hands to be one of the most powerful instruments in demolishing superstition and prejudice, and in training up a race distinguished by intelligence and it may be devoted piety, what in the present heathenish state of things is the course of instruction that ought to be pursued with the clearest prospect of speedy and triumphant success? Ought it to be limited in kind and degree so as to admit of being spread at the same expense of means over a wider surface and render available to a greater mass of the juvenile population? Or ought it to be multiplied in kind and increased in degree, and consequently be restricted to a narrower sphere and a more select number, with the view of ultimately and more speedily reaching the entire mass through the instrumentality of those awakened and enlightened? In other words, is it better to pursue the direct method of attempting at once to impart a general elementary knowledge to the many, or the indirect method of attempting to reach the many through the agency of the instructed few? Each of these methods has had its advocates. Each has now been tried in different parts of India with various success. Judging, however, from past facts and appearances, we may safely aver that till of date the friends of Christianity in India have in a great measure, and with 2 or 3 exceptions, adopted and patronized the more limited or elementary course of instruction, partly from its being unavoidable at the commencement, and partly from its apparent directness of application to the great body of the people. In other words, their efforts seem to have been chiefly confined to the general elementary instruction of children or youths much below the age of puberty. But is this the best mode of attaining the great end proposed? Are those means necessarily the best from which their apparent directness of application may at first view promise to be the most efficacious? Or suppose the mode and the means to be the best and most practicable at the outset, does it follow that they must always continue to be so? As we are compelled to answer in the negative, it now devolves upon us to adduce satisfactory reasons. Here it may be promised that as regards any plan which may have for its object the direct instruction of the mass of the people, we must at once be struck with the consideration that all the combined resources of Christian benevolence at present are and must ever be incommensurate with the vastness of their undertaking. This the advocates of general elementary instruction are willing to admit. They scruple not to avow that the disproportion between the means and the object contemplated is truly appalling. Yet they console themselves with the hope that, to the extent to which the field is occupied, real good is effected. But what is this good? What is the nature and amount? And how produced? These are questions which we believe number of the supporters of Christian missions seldom think of asking in a scrutinizing, intelligible form. And yet the importance of the result to which a proper answer would lead, either as defending the propriety of present plans from the desultory attacks of some and the systematic opposition of others, or as establishing the desirableness of a change of measures by which a more efficient direction might be given to our resources and money and influence, is enough to challenge an investigation. The truth is that when the intelligence is conveyed that several schools have been organized, that large numbers of youth are in regular attendance, and that small portions of the Christian scriptures are daily read, the good people at home and in India generally rest content, not because of indifference or apathy, but because of easy, incurious self-complacency. They immediately conclude that much good is doing, and they are predisposed to expect still more, without any very definite notion of what the good is, or of the process by which it has been or is to be brought about. Or, if the subject be allowed to excite a temporary share of curiosity and reflection, the mind would appear to be satisfied with some loose and vague notions respecting the change which the gift of reading, and especially the ability to read sacred books, must somehow or other produce on the rising generation, in the way of disarming prejudice and creating a thirst after knowledge, which may eventually prove of the utmost advantage to the rapid spread of Christianity. Nay, there often lingers an indefinite impression that those who in early youth have been taught to peruse portions of the Bible, even though these should be perused with much the same kind of feeling as would be the fragments of a Puranic tale, and though the tuition should be conducted as it has hitherto been, in 9 cases out of 10 under a heathen master, must surely in manhood openly avow themselves followers of the cross. That an elementary education may qualify for the common business of a humble life, that it may in some instances render certain terms familiar, which on account of their strangeness always prove repulsive to the adult or wholly uneducated, when addressed directly on the solemn truths of religion, and that in these respects something has already been achieved, may readily be acknowledged. But that any decided permanent change in the national intellect, any real diminution of prejudice or of attachment to established forms or of resistance to the reception of a holier faith, can to any great extent be traced to or reasonably expected to result from such a course of education, it would require a sacrifice of judgment to enthusiasm to believe. Let the matter be coolly and rationally examined. Let evidence be weighed, let due deference be paid to the voice of experience, let the constitution or successions of state in the human mind be attended to. I admit that thousands of children are initiated into the elements of education, that they can read ordinary books, write with tolerable ease, and cast accounts with creditable facility, and that much of what we may deem surpassing in beauty and utility has been accurately committed to memory. And what is the result? Is it a result fraught with benefits superior in kind and lasting in duration? How much of what has been imparted to the boy at no small expense will possess a vivifying, regenerating influence, how much will fixedly cling to and permanently influence the conduct and character of the man? Generally, nothing at all beyond the artificial or mechanical parts of the acquisition. Nothing save the ability to read, write, or apply to the cases of petty dealing the simplistic rules of arithmetic. The boy is positively too young to imbibe, and the instruction received too meagre to impart any vital principle which can keep even the knowledge acquired fresh upon the memory, or can create that inextinguishable curiosity which will not be allayed till the means of gratification are secured. And if his own mind has not attained to that standard of proficiency which will be of material benefit to himself, how is it possible for any influence to emanate from him that will produce the slightest impression on the surrounding multitudes? It is unfair to judge of this subject by a reference to the state of things in Great Britain, though such reference, properly made, may aid the conceptions of those whose circumstances have not enabled them visibly to perceive the difference. Now, in Great Britain, what is the usual effect of a mere elementary education, such as that communicated in a common village school? Is there anything ordinarily conveyed which, as a literary acquisition, can raise an individual to an eminence above his fellows, by widening his narrow circle within which his thoughts and sentiments would naturally revolve? Or is there anything conveyed which can excite a hearty desire to pursue the study of literature and science, with the view of enlarging his own mind and benefiting the community in which he moves? It must be seldom indeed, we presume, that at a village school such knowledge can be acquired, or such ardent desires awakened. And why? Because from the immaturity of the habit of reflection, much of what is read does not cleave to the mind as digested knowledge incorporated, as it were, with the very substance of mind, and forming the staple of thought, because from the meagreness of the acquisition itself, viewed in combination with this cause, the mind does not and cannot obtain that tasting of literature and science which would inevitably ensure an increasing appetite for more. But it may be said that in the case of the great body of the people, there is nothing to render it an object in itself particularly desirable that many should attain to an intellectual superiority, which might enable them to exert a personal influence on those around, that it is quite enough if, by being taught to read, they are endowed with the ability to peruse and understand that precious volume which conveys the knowledge that maketh man wise unto salvation. Without at present disputing the sufficiency of this endowment in a land where the Bible is believed and read almost by all, let us attend to its own independent effects, not when left unexercised, but when cultivated with diligence and unceasing care. Let us refer to those who with heart and soul are engaged in the work of communicating the rudiments not only of secular but of religious knowledge to British youth. And what is the constant burden of their complaint? The one note of lamentation that is never out of tune. Is it not the meagre appearance of fruit as the result of all their devoted labours? And what is the source of their encouragement to persevere in the task apparently so toilsome and profitless? Is it not the hope of realizing some distant ultimate benefit? Whence is this remote benefit expected to arise? Is it from the sole unaided power of surviving impressions of early education? Scarcely ever. It is mainly from the expectation that individuals so taught may, in after life, be situated among those whose sentiments and example, tallying with instructions formerly delivered and practices formerly recommended, may reawaken and call forth into lively exercise principles of thought and action that had been imbibed in youth, but had lain dormant in the secret chambers of the soul. And it is chiefly on account of the greater facility with which, in such cases, sound impressions may be produced and deepened by the general influences that ever radiate from and circulate amongst the members of a well-ordered and well-cultivated society, that the propriety of bestowing early culture, however limited, is defended, and its actual bestowment proved to be more or less advantageous. If then, in a land where every circumstance is favourable to the growth of what is noble and generous, in a land where the reciprocation of enlightened opinions is free as the air of the heaven, in a land where the sacred and civil institutions, the improved manners and customs, the records and traditions of centuries, the associations and pastimes of infancy, and above all the religious faith and observances of the people, all fully harmonize with the elementary knowledge, literary and religious, that is imparted, and if with these incalculable advantages, such knowledge, apart from after means of improvement, or those external social and spiritual influences which quicken and mature, generally fails in producing those decided changes that would materially affect the individual himself or ameliorate the condition of society, who that has any pretensions to a reflecting mind may not discern the utter powerlessness of such elementary principles, literary and religious, in operating the anticipated changes. In a country where the knowledge, instead of fully harmonizing, is found to run counter to all the institutions, manners, customs, habits, rites, ceremonies, traditions, metaphysical and religious opinions of the whole mass of the people. In a country, too, where as yet there scarcely exist any of those after means of quickening latent energies, of developing the seeds of latent knowledge, any of those reviving influences which issue from and healthfully play around the entire fabric of a well-regulated community, will it still be objected by some that all this is mere theorizing? It may, but we would urge, yea, beseech them to reconsider the matter and see whether it be not rather a legitimate deduction from unquestionable facts. And should any doubt yet remain, we would appeal to a circumstance too weighty to be overlooked, and too conclusive to admit of evasion. Why is it that so many eyewitnesses complain of the littleness of visible effect arising from the institution and multiplication of elementary schools, allowing the efficacy which issues in conversion to be wholly beyond, and that which issues in mere intellectual or other temporal environment to be to a great extent within the control of human agency? Why do we hear so many sincere friends of the Christian cause marvel that no positive change towards a better condition of society has appeared from the extensive educationary operations which have been conducted under Christian management for the last 40 years? Is not every expression of wonder on the part of those who have the means of judging conclusive testimony as to the certainty of the fact that no charge has yet been effected by the operations in question, which bears a just proportion to the time and means already expended? And does not the preceding view afford a most natural, if not the only adequate explanation of the fact? Again, we say, let the subject be duly pondered. Let it be contemplated in all its bearings. Like the sand-like character of the youthful mind be considered, its levity, its instability, its light-hearted carelessness. Let the meagreness of the knowledge and the insufficiency of the mode in which even that little is imparted be steadily kept in view. More especially let the meditative spirit dwell on the circumstance that whatever instruction is in the first instance conveyed flows unmixed in one distinct channel, and that all the feelings, sentiments, and actions of young and old among the people flow unremoved and unamalgamated in another channel, essentially separated from the former. And instead of greatly marveling that the aspect of society has not undergone more important changes, we may well be filled with astonishment at the want of sagacity or unreasonableness of those who could seriously expect changes so great and so decisive to result from causes so utterly inadequate. The ingredients that unite in swelling the current which flows in each channel exhibit in one respect the peculiar property of those substances that possess no chemical affinity, those substances that are not only mutually distinct but mutually repulsive of each other. And if it be held an object of importance wholly to displace that which has the preoccupancy, it can never be effected by the application of a small portion of antagonist ingredients, as these might float innocuously to the surface. If affected at all, the one must be gradually dislodged by a corresponding increase in the volume of the other. That, in the case of education as hitherto generally conducted in India, this truth has yet been sufficient. is widely remote of the truth. This increase has yet been sufficient, is widely remote of the truth. For it is wholly incredible that mere elementary instruction, communicated under numberless disadvantages, can ever bear any reasonable proportion to the stupendous mass of prejudice and superstition which it is intended to remove or destroy. Nor is the good effected by such a limited system simply partial in its nature and contracted in its extent. It is very uncertain in its duration. Imagine a case in our own highly favored land. Suppose that from some of these almost subterranean caverns in the heart of our great cities, where ignorance, vice, and profanity reign with unchecked dominion, hundreds of youth, no matter from what motives, are induced to attend one of our elementary Christian schools. Suppose that during the period of their attendance they are exposed, evening and morning at home, to all the brutalizing influences of unhallowed lips and profligate examples. Suppose that after 1 or 2 years, at the early age of 6, 7, 8, or 9, they are all removed from school and again wholly shut up within the haunts of ungodliness and immorality, no more accessible to the warning voice of the teacher or the preacher or any Christian friend. What impression could we ordinarily expect to be conveyed to them at so tender an age, in such adverse circumstances, which would cling to them in afterlife, in spite of the unopposed host of corrupting temptations and seductive allurements to folly, sin, and shame? And yet this is but a faint and feeble picture of the real condition of the great majority of elementary mission schools in India. Hundreds and thousands of children may, from various motives, be induced to attend. At home they are encompassed with a demoralizing influence of a loathsome superstition. After an attendance of 1 or 2 years, they are withdrawn from school. They then replunged into the dead sea of an abominable heathenism, are swallowed up in it, and for the most part, no more heard of by those who would gladly guide them towards Zion. What lasting impression can, in such circumstances, be expected to be communicated? We are aware that there are occasional instances of persons who in youth happen to receive an elementary education, having in riper years become converts to the Christian faith. But in these cases, it were a glaring misapprehension of the real nature of the facts to attribute the enlightened reception of Christianity as an effect to the elementary education as the proximate instrumental cause. The lines have fallen to these individuals in more pleasant places. By the working of a gracious providence, they have for a season escaped, as it were, from the vortex of heathen society, and during that time have come in contact with some of the people of God, and from these have emanated an influence which has been blessed in subduing the souls of the wanderers to the Saviour. All such cases, instead of proving the inherent power of rudimental instruction in effecting great changes on character, only furnish an admirable illustration of the efficacy of after-social and spiritual influences to awaken into life and enshrine with the glories of true light and liberty. The real question then is this: of all the thousands of youth who have received a mere elementary education, how many have, in consequences and solely in consequence of it, contributed in afterlife to the diffusion of free and enlightened sentiments? How many have lent a more favorable ear to the announcement of the glad tidings? How many have become burning and shining lights? How many would be found able and disposed to uphold even the present inadequate supply? In the event of European agents and influence being wholly withdrawn, we fear that the most boundless charity would weep over the scantiness of the catalogue. Indeed, so long as there is no living principle infused to maintain life, and no active leaven to quicken the dull, sluggish mass, things must in a great measure remain at once substationary and absolutely dependent on foreign aid which from its very nature must be feeble and precarious. And should no change of plans be sanctioned by the legislative almoners of Christian benevolence at home, the hands of the executive in India must continue bound as with iron fetters, and the state of mental imbecility in childhood, so far as the cause in question shall operate, must be perpetuated from age to age. After the removal of 1,000 generations and the profuse expenditure of thousands of lives and tens of thousands of gold and silver, we might look around for fruit without discerning any to regale the eyes or to cheer the heart. And even then might the sudden removal of foreign agency be the signal for a speedy and general relapse. This state of things suggests to us an extreme, but somewhat analogous case. In a country wholly destitute of indigenous forests, a new colony is planted. The soil is naturally excellent, and by proper cultivation may be made to bear the most useful products of foreign climes. Among others, the seeds of trees of different species are transported and deposited in the earth. They soon germinate and grow, but the country is excessively cold, and the foreign supply of large timber being barely sufficient for shipbuilding, machinery, etc., all the young and rising plants are successively cut down for firewood. None are allowed to attain to the maturity of growth that is necessary for bearing fruit. At length, by some rupture among the nations and some disastrous inroad of nature's elements, all supplies from abroad are cut off. Must not the general misery of the people be inevitable? Certainly. And yet, had prudence and judgment guided their counsels and directed their efforts, instead of a limited and precarious supply from abroad, they might have had numbers of seed-bearing trees that would soon reproduce and multiply their kind 1,000-fold, and at no very remote period meet or even exceed every possible demand, and thus render the inhabitants independent of all future contingencies. From the whole train of the preceding remarks, what conclusion ought to be drawn? Is it not this, that in the present circumstances, all efforts which may be confined to the direct method of diffusing merely elementary knowledge among the dense mass of the heathen youth of India must be very inadequate, and if exclusively pursued can entail little else than expense, failure, and disappointment. Hence, much of the unfruitfulness of the system of elementary instruction, which from various causes, in many respects unavoidable, has hitherto been chiefly prosecuted in mission schools, a system occupying a sphere so very limited as scarcely to embrace any of those higher objects, without the attainment to which all previous advantages are comparatively lost, the youthful plants, from the premature abandonment of them, not being allowed to fructify and grow into strength, and shoot out into the heavens their wide-spreading boughs. Hence the frank and ready acknowledgement made of late years by so many who have had the benefit of experience and corresponding determination to bend a more special attention toward the indirect method of imparting life and strength to the few, which will at once impel and enable them to exert a potent influence over the many. Hence the persuasion that we ought no longer to rest satisfied with the thought of conferring some limited, uncertain benefit, and carelessly indulge the hope of producing some future undefined good, that after surveying the field and taking reason and experience for our guides, we ought to confess that to restrict ourselves to the speed of elementary knowledge is in great measure a fruitless waste of our time, our strength, and our pecuniary resources. Since any doubtful good which may be immediately produced must terminate in and perish with the individual. Hence the growing persuasion that since our design is to reach most speedily, efficiently, and permanently the great mass of the people, we ought openly to avow the chief means to be, so far as regards education, not the elementary instruction of the youth at large, but the rising up and qualifying a body of special agents, whose minds, from the length and variety of their studies, might be quickened, expanded, and enlightened. In every individual in whom we thus concentrate the rays of a higher knowledge, we provide a new source whence shall emanate and diverge the rays of quickening truth, to vivify and illume all within the reach of its influence. And if all who are thus taught do not engage directly in the work of disseminating true knowledge among their countrymen, they cannot fail to teach extensively by their example, to imprint a new character on their own children, and to impart and support the adoption of any measures that may have for their object the diffusion of sound and enlarged sentiment. Were the friends of missions, therefore, regularly to inquire how many young men are engaged in a course of study in the higher departments of knowledge, instead of how many children are receiving instruction in the elementary schools, they would undoubtedly find in the answer to the former inquiry by much the surer test of the present and prospective advancement of the Hindus. Indeed, so strong is our conviction on this subject that we do not hesitate to say that it would augur more for the real welfare of India were 10 privileged to receive the higher instruction rather than 1,000 admitted to the elementary schools. Do we then disapprove of the organization of schools of the latter description? Quite the contrary. In the face of all opposition, we would again and again reiterate the statement that in the first instance, such schools must be instituted. But it is one thing to assert the necessity of preparatory measures, and quite another to rest in these as the ultimate end. These were indeed a humiliation of judgment. This were indeed a humiliation of judgment. If the condition of society be such that few or none of the young are at once qualified and willing to enter on a course of higher study, what expedient can be devised save that of opening initiatory schools in which the proper qualifications may be acquired? But would it indicate much wisdom to stop there and expend in wasteful extravagance our resources on the subordinate object? With very limited means at our disposal compared with the exigencies of the case, we should value and support inferior schools, principally on account of their auxiliary connection with a higher seminary. And whenever that connection ceases to exist, and the elementary school forms no longer one of the nurseries of a superior institution, we should certainly hesitate to expend much on its continuance. Between the two grades of institution, there would be a reciprocal action and reaction. While the lower supplied the higher with disciplined pupils, the higher would tend to infuse new life into the lower, as vacancies in the former would be filled up by pupils selected from the latter on account of their proficiency. This constant removal of those who distinguish themselves to enjoy the benefit of a superior education would operate as a powerful and salutary stimulus throughout the entire system. Wholesome emulation would thereby be excited, increased exertion would ensue, and greater sacrifice would be made by parents and guardians to ensure the regularity and prolong the period of attendance. Indeed, when the advantages consequent to a course of study in the higher education began to be understood by a community rapidly growing in intelligence, the requisite qualifications for admission might often be exacted without incurring the previous trouble and expense of communicating them. To sum up the whole in a few words, from a full and comprehensive view of the nature and constitution of man, specially as modified by the Brahminical system, from the feebleness of impression on the youthful mind in matters that require abstract thought, or tend vitally to affect and permanently to change the heart, from the buoyant restlessness of the Hindu character, from the obliterating and stupefying tendency of the countless abominations of heathenism, from the pressing wants and growing necessities of a society newly awakening from the torpor of a long and dreary night, from the lessons of a past experience which present little else to the catalogue of failures to warn and instruct, from these and other circumstances which might be indefinitely enlarged upon, it must be adjudged essential towards securing the full benefits of a Christian educational course that above and beyond mere elementary schools, separate institutions should be founded for the express purpose of turning the former to full account, for the express purpose of communicating that higher knowledge in every department of literature, science, and theology, the possession of which, with the divine blessing, naturally tends to stamp and permanently to fix the character, for the express purpose of preventing many a promising plant from being exposed to every rude blast and every scorching ray, instead of being transferred to a more genial soil and a more kindly atmosphere, where its root might spread and its branches wave defiance to every tempest. In the present condition of the people of India, one such central seminary of a higher grade, with its attendant retinue of preparatory gymnasia, would do more towards vitally impressing the intellect and heart of the people, and consequently towards furthering the great cause of natural regeneration, than any number of elementary schools, however indefinitely.